this lesson is to graph lines using table of values. So let's just quickly review the two terms. The terms are slope and y-intercept. So as we know, slope is equal to rise over run, and y-intercept is a point where the line crosses y-axis. So we need these two points in our graph for be able to understand how we can do graphing. So let's see how we can graph each of the following lines. I'm going to do a couple for you, and then you guys try the next two. So the equation of the line is y equals 3x plus 2. So now we need to create a table of values using some x values and find the relative y values from there. So for example, for the first one here, if x is negative 2, what will be the value of y? So what we need to do is, where x is in the equation, we need to replace it by whatever number that is in the equation with that number and solve for y. So for the first one, what would that be? Since we are multiplying 3 and x, so this is going to become 3 times negative 2 plus 2. Now you don't have to write it like that. I'm just writing it, what number would you get if you have that? 3 times negative 2 is negative 6, plus 6 is negative 4. So all you have to do is, you can just write here negative 4. Similarly, for the next one, what will that be? 3 times negative 1. So here, you're now replacing this x with the negative 1. So 3 times negative 1 is negative 3, plus 1 would be negative 1. So this would be negative 1. And if x is 0, 3 times 0 is 0, plus 2 is 2. 3 times 1 is 3, plus 2 would be 5. And 3 times 2 is 6. 6 plus 2 is 8. So these are your table of values. So now we are going to create our graph from here. So when we create a graph, we are just going to plot the coordinates. So for example, if x is negative 2, y is negative 4. So when we look in our graph, where would that point be? When x is negative 2, y is negative 4, so that would be right here. So let's plot a point here. The first point would be x is negative 2, y is negative 4. The next one is x is negative 1, y is negative 1, right here. 0, 2, 1, 5, so right 1, up 5. 2, 8, right 2, up 8. So this is your graph for the line. So now using this, we are going to graph our line. And the line looks like this. Okay, now let's look at the second example. In the second example here, our equation has a fraction. So when we have a fraction, we have to be very careful with the number that we choose for x values. In this example here, the x is already filled up for you. And if you look at the x values, they're not going up by ones. The reason for that is because if we go up by ones, we will end up getting a decimal for y value. Decimals are very hard to plot. So that's why we pick numbers that would work so that you don't get decimals. So how do we decide what numbers to pick? For that, you're going to look at the denominator here. So here it's 2, and that's why we are taking all the factors of 2 as your y values. So when we take factors of 2, all of these fractions are going to become whole numbers, and you will end up with no decimals. So for the first one, if you have negative half, so you have negative half times negative 4, because x is negative 4. So what would that be? That becomes 2. And 2 plus 1 is 3. So your first value here will be 3. And the next one would be negative half times negative 2. It becomes 1, and 1 plus 1 is 2. So if you see the pattern, all the values are going to go up by 1 every 2 values of x. So the next one would be 1, 0, and negative 1. So these are your values for the second graph. So here we have negative 4 and 3, negative 2 and 2, 0, 1, 2, 0, and 4, negative 1. So when you graph, it's going to look like this. Now I'm using colors, but you guys will be using labels. So if you're labeling, I would label this as B, and this would be A. So label this as A. Make sure you're labeling your graphs very well. Okay, now you can pause your video and finish the rest and see if your answer matches with my answers. And for the last table of values, I just want to point you guys for the values of x. What values of x will you pick if you are choosing, if you see the denominator is 4? So all your values of x should be factors of 4. Now you can pause the video and come back and see if you got it right. Okay, I hope your graph and your table of values matches with my graph and table of values. Now let's look at the next part. In the next part, you're asked to figure out the slope and the y-intercept for each of these lines. I'm going to do one for you, and then you do the other two. So here, the first equation, which is the red line, line A, y equals 3x plus 2, you have to figure out the slope and the y-intercept. So what is the definition of slope again? Slope is rise over run. So from the graph, when we are figuring out slope, we do rise over run. So rise is 3, run is 1. So your slope would be 3 over 1. And you can just write it as 3. You don't have to write over 1. And again, y-intercept is the point where the graph crosses the y-axis. So in this case, what's the y-intercept? 2, because that's the point where the graph crosses the y-axis. So your y-intercept is 2. So now you can pause the video and see if you can get the slope and the y-intercept for all the lines, and then match your answers with my answers. Okay, so now let's see, what did you learn from this chart? So in this chart, if you notice, slope, I'm going to highlight all the slopes. So slope in your equation is all the coefficient of x. Look at the numbers, they match with all these. And the y-intercept is all your constant values. So 2, 1, negative 3, negative 5. Those are all your y-intercept. So you can make a note here that slope in your equation is the coefficient of x. And the y-intercept is the constant value, constant. So again, so what does slope tell us? Slope tell us that what is the direction of the line and how steep your line is. So the bigger the number, so if you look at your line A versus line D, line A had slope. So now let's see what happens for line A. For line A, what's the slope? The slope is 3. And let's look at line D. Line D has a slope of 3 over 4. So if you compare the two numbers 3 and 4, which number is bigger? 3 is bigger than 3 over 4. And that's why if you look in your graph, line A is more steep than line D. So the bigger the number, the steeper the line, ignoring the negative sign. So you cannot consider negative sign, means nothing. Negative sign just tells you the direction of the line, whereas the number tells you the steepness of the line. And the second thing that we have learned today is looking at the y-intercept. What's y-intercept? Y-intercept is the point where the graph crosses the y-axis. So it tells us the location of the line on the graph. Without y-intercept, we cannot graph a line, it becomes difficult for you to graph a line. So this was a lesson today. Please go ahead and finish your practice work now.